Hello and welcome to today's Just Like Us masterclass workshop with Sacha Coward on myths and legends. We're really excited to see you all here today. At Just Like Us, we give talks in schools about being different and celebrating our differences. This workshop is part of the Just Like Us Diversity Week, celebrating diversity and being LGBT+ in education. This year's Diversity Week is a little different to usual as we're broadcasting to you all live online. Now, before I get into how this workshop will work, can we all please watch a short video on how to keep ourselves safe online?
Hello, we hope you're enjoying loads of interesting activities for School Diversity Week. Millions of young people are a part of this and you must keep safe online. So as part of this, we are moderating and disabling public comments you might make on our social media so we can protect your identities. If you do want to communicate something to us, please just direct message us on our social media platforms, or you can email info@justlikeus.org so we make sure that we're still protecting your identity. Justlikeus.org/betteronline has more information about this and also has some information about where you can go for help or where someone else can go if they need help.
Thank you all for watching that. It's really important that we know how to keep ourselves safe online. So we will shortly hear from Sacha, who will give his talk on myths and legends. This workshop will run for approximately 40 minutes. After the talk, Sacha will be answering some questions from our lovely ambassadors who are here with us today. Before I hand over to Sacha, let me introduce him to you all properly. Sacha has worked in museums for around 10 years now, where he works with LGBT+ history. He has given talks and tours on subjects such as LGBT+ characters in video games. He describes himself as a mermaid hunter due to his expert knowledge on mermaid folklore. He passionately believes that history and art should be diverse and inclusive. He believes museums can create powerful places for diversity, meaning accepting and understanding people's differences. So let me hand over to Sacha, who is here to talk to us today.
Hello, so welcome to my session. Now, I have to have a bit of a confession to you. I am obsessed with myths and legends. So you might have heard a few Greek myths or Roman legends before. These are stories that people have used to explain the world that they live in. Now, my name is Sacha. My pronouns are he and him, and I love working in museums. I love old stuff. And I've got 4 cracking stories to share with you today. They're all myths and legends. Most of them are Greek or Roman, and they have a bit of a twist in that they might involve people whose gender or gender identity fits between the gaps of what today we might call a man or a woman, or they might celebrate a love between a man or a woman and a woman. These are stories that resonate with people who define as LGBTQ+. That's lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender and queer. So the first story that I'm going to tell you about is the myth of Hyacinthus. So the thing to understand about ancient Greece is that they believed that there were loads of gods, pretty much a god for anything that you could think of. And they all lived right at the top of Mount Olympus. Now, one of these gods was the god Apollo. Now, Apollo was the god of poetry, but he was also the god that drew the sun across the sky in a chariot. Now, Apollo had many lovers, many boyfriends and girlfriends. But one day when he was looking down all the way up from Mount Olympus, he saw this young man, a young man called Hyacinthus. Now, Hyacinthus was a Spartan prince and he was famously beautiful. Everyone fell in love with him. Men, women, the spirits and nymphs of the forest, everyone thought he was gorgeous. And so did Apollo. Now, Apollo wasn't the only one who was caught by Hyacinthus's beauty. At the same time, another god was watching called Zephyrus. Now, Zephyrus was one of 4 wind gods. He was the god of the west wind. And he had been watching Hyacinthus too, thinking, God, I wish I could ask him out. He's so good looking. But Apollo beat him to it. He came down on his chariot, drew the sun down from the sky. And so Hyacinthus was so impressed that he basically said, okay, all right, fine, I'll date you. And the two were inseparable, the man and the immortal. And they would go off hiking and hunting and playing games together. And one of the favorite things that they would do was to play discus. And if you see the picture in the top right corner, that statue, that's the Greek game of discus, which is a bit like frisbee, except the frisbee is really heavy and made of stone or metal. And you see how far you can throw it. Now, Apollo, as well as being a god, was a bit of a show-off. So he threw his discus as far as he could throw it. And when it hit the sky, it broke the sound barrier. And with a clap of lightning, it split the sky and all the clouds scattered. Now, Zephyrus, who'd been watching, was incredibly jealous of this couple. So he did something really sneaky. He caused the winds to start to blow. And that discus, which was flying away from Apollo and Hyacinthus, started to come back a bit like a boomerang. And it hit the ground, bounced off the ground, and hit Hyacinthus in the head. And he collapsed on the floor. Now, Apollo was devastated. And in the picture you see there, he's holding his boyfriend because he's terrified that he's going to die. He called all of the gods down from Olympus, and they brought ambrosia and nectar, the food of the gods that can bring people back to life. But even with that, Hyacinthus was gone. He was too badly injured. And where the blood from the wound in his head dropped onto the ground, a group of flowers grew. Now, Apollo was devastated, but every year, year after year in spring, these flowers would bloom, the flowers in memory of his lover, Hyacinthus. And to this day, we call the flower hyacinth, which is pictured on the bottom right, based on the love between Apollo and Hyacinthus. Now, another story that I want to tell you about that you may not have heard of is about Iphis and Ianthe. So back in ancient Greek times, if you were a woman, it could be quite a hard life. Now, the idea being when you were born, if you were a daughter, you were expected to be married off as quickly as possible. But as a downside, if you had a child who was a girl, if you had a daughter, you were also expected to pay a dowry. That means that when your daughter married a man, you would have to pay a lot of money to his family. So if you were poor, having a daughter could be really difficult. So Lygdus and Telethesia were two poor Greeks. And at this point, they discovered that Telethesia, Lygdus's wife, had become pregnant and was going to have a baby. And they were excited, but they were terrified that she might have a girl. Because if a girl was born, well, they'd have to pay a dowry and they couldn't afford it. Now, Lygdus got drunk one night. And when he came home after drinking, he said, if you have a girl, if we have a daughter, I'm going to throw her into the river Tiber. I'm going to drown her. Horrible thing to say. And Telethesia, the woman, was devastated and terrified. So she prayed not to a Greek god, but to the Egyptian god Isis. And the Egyptian god Isis came down and said to her, you will have a daughter. I'm sorry to tell you, but don't cry. I have a solution. So she put on a magical glamour. Now, a glamour is kind of like an illusion that gods can create. And by doing this, even though the baby that was born would have been assigned female at birth, would have been thought to be a girl, everyone that saw this child saw a young boy. And this young boy was called Iphis. And as Iphis grew up, he was raised as a young man. He did manly things in Greece. And when he got to a certain age, he was expected to marry a woman. And that's when he met a young woman called Ianthe. And they fell in love instantly. They were inseparable. They would go out together holding hands. But then one day when they were walking, the god Jove, so this is the Roman god, the lord of all the gods, saw the trick that had been played by Isis, and he clicked his fingers to remove the glamour. And there was Iphis in the form that he had been born in. Now, Ianthe didn't care that many people may have looked at Iphis and said, that's a woman. Iphis and Ianthe were still in love, but they were devastated because under Greek law, two women were not allowed to marry. And it didn't matter that Iphis saw himself as a man. So again, they went to the temple of Isis, the Egyptian goddess who had helped before. And when they went there, they prayed for a solution. And Isis came down again. And this time she put a glamour so powerful that everyone would see Iphis as a man, just the way that Iphis identified. And so Iphis and Ianthe got married, and the marriage was so big that it was even attended by the goddess of marriages herself, and no one ever bothered them again. The next myth is the story of Ganymede. So Ganymede was a young shepherd, and he was incredibly beautiful. Many people lusted after him, including the king of the gods, all the way up in Olympus, Zeus himself. Now, the gods loved to have big parties where they would have ambrosia, this kind of cup of liquid that kept them immortal, which they would drink. Apparently, it was delicious. Anyway, Zeus was looking for a new cupbearer, someone that would travel around the table and hand this drink out to all of the different gods. And he looked down and he saw this young shepherd boy, Ganymede, and he thought, I want that boy. That boy is beautiful. That boy is perfect. So the way that he did this is he transformed himself into an eagle, flew down from the godly plane and plucked Ganymede from earth and flew him back to Olympus. There Ganymede found himself up in Mount Olympus, surrounded by the gods. And there he worked as a cupbearer. So he would walk around the tables carrying a glass of wine or ambrosia from god to god. But every night he would share the bed with Zeus, for the two were very in love. Now the issue is, Zeus was already married to the queen of the gods, Hera, and Hera was so jealous. She could not believe that her husband had taken a mortal boy to be his cupbearer, and that they were flirting together, and that they were talking to each other, whispering sweet nothings. She was disgusted. And then one day she saw Ganymede handing the cup to Zeus. And just before he handed the cup, he kissed the side of the cup as a token of his affection. And Hera was furious. She was having none of it. So one night, because every night Ganymede would go over to the edge of Olympus and look down on the earthly realm to see if he could see any of the members of his family that he'd left behind. And Hera snuck up behind him and pushed him off the edge. And he went tumbling and falling. But before he could fall to his death, Zeus saw what was happening. And with a click of his fingers, he transformed Ganymede not just into a god, but into a constellation. He became the constellation we call Aquarius, the cupbearer, the water bearer. And to this day, it's one of the signs of the zodiac. Also, if you look at the planet Jupiter, so if you look at this picture here, do you see that smaller planet? Well, it's not a planet, it's a moon. It's the biggest moon of Jupiter, which is called Ganymede. Jupiter is a name for Zeus. So to this day, Zeus and Ganymede are still allowed to be together. Now, my last story for you is about Cetus. Now, Cetus was born, and when they were born, everyone thought that they were a woman, and they thought that they were a beautiful woman. But Cetus didn't really disagree. Cetus was sick to death of being followed by men and hounded, being told how beautiful they were and would they marry them. They were sick to death of it because all they wanted to do was to go down onto the seashore, collect beautiful seashells and go swimming in peace. And one day they were swimming in the sea and they thought they had the beach all to themselves, but they were being watched by the god Poseidon. Now, Poseidon was the god of the sea, and he had been watching Cetus for some time, been thinking, what a beautiful person this is. I will have this person for my wife. So suddenly Poseidon emerged from the sea, dripping water, terrifying, and came over to Cetus and said, you will be my wife. And Cetus said, I will not be your wife. For I do not see myself as a woman. I do not see myself as a man. Leave me alone. But Poseidon followed Cetus everywhere, and Cetus was getting sick to death of it. Finally, Poseidon said, look, will you love me if I give you one wish? Anything you want. I don't care. I will promise I will give you anything. And Cetus said, anything? You'll give me anything I want. And Poseidon said again, yes, I promise I'll give you anything. And so Cetus made a wish, and that wish was that they would be a man, that everyone would see them as the greatest warrior of all time, and no longer would they be followed and hounded by men wanting their hand in marriage and annoying gods who were bored and wanted a wife. And now suddenly Poseidon saw that he'd fallen into a trap because he had to stick by this. And so he granted the wish, and Cetus became the most fearsome warrior known to mankind. Cetus, who now defined as he, went off and fought the centaurs in a great battle between humans and the centaurs, which were half horse and half human. And during this great battle, he slew and killed many of the centaurs. But there was one centaur, one giant centaur who saw this and took his revenge on the warrior that was Cenas. He took a giant tree and smashed it over Cenas's head until Cenas was hammered into the ground. And it is said that Cenas suffocated and died. Now, Cenas's soul went to the underworld, where all ancient Greeks believed people went when you died. Cenas was terrified. What if when I come to the underworld, if I go to Elysium, the Greek version of heaven, what happens if I'm returned to my previous body? But when they arrived, they still had the body of a man, the body that Poseidon had given them. And when they asked the fates, why is this? Why have you allowed me to stay a man? The fates said, because you were always a man. Before Poseidon gave you that gift, you already saw yourself that way. And so they spent eternity in a heavenly version of Elysium where they dined with gods and satyrs, and they spent the rest of eternity as a man. So those are 4 myths that I've just told you. 4 myths that you might not have heard before, because we often hear myths where men marry women and women marry men, where men are men and women are women. But actually, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans had a very different vision of how people could be. Sometimes people could change from one gender to another. Sometimes people were somewhere in between, and men could fall in love with men and women could fall in love with women. Now, I'm really excited to take some questions now based on these 4 stories.
Thank you, Sacha, so much. I really enjoyed all of those stories and about the myths. I really loved how some of them even relate to like the constellations and space. It was really interesting. So we're going to turn to our questions that some of our ambassadors have got for you. So our first ambassador, Arbor, has a question for you.
Hello. Thank you for the great presentation. My first question is there anything we can in the 21st century learn from ancient Greece or Rome in terms of their myths and legends?
So yeah, that's a really great question, because obviously these stories come from a very long time ago. And myths and legends were a way of explaining the world that the Greeks lived in. So if they saw a thunderstorm or a rainbow, they'd come up with a story about gods and creatures to explain how that happened. The thing for me that I think we can learn is that often we forget that in the past, people saw themselves in all kinds of ways. Nowadays, in stories that we tell today, we often get stuck just talking about men and women and men who marry women and women who fall in love with men. And we can see that in the past, the ancient past, people had different ways of living. The ancient Greeks, thousands of years ago, understood that there are loads of different ways of being a man, and there are loads of different ways of being a woman, and there are loads of different ways of being something in between or neither, and that all of those are fine. So if we can learn one thing, it's that the Greeks got it, they understood it, but why can't we?
Thank you. I love that answer. We're now going to turn to our ambassador, Monica, who has a question for you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, but I had a question. Why are more LGBT plus people out? Are there more LGBT plus people who are out now than 100 years ago?
That's a really interesting question. One of the reasons is, so today we still have a lot of issues for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer people, people whose gender identity is different, people who love people of the same gender. But actually, it's very progressive compared to about 100 years ago. So about 100 years ago, it would have been very, very difficult to live publicly as a transgender person, to live publicly as a gay or bisexual person. That being said, if we go back 1,000 years, we see that there were people who would have defined that way, and it was kind of seen as fine. So in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, you could have lovers of the same sex, of the same gender. And in many societies, like even the Vikings, for example, you could transition, you could be born and assign one gender and transition to another. So all we're seeing is a snapshot in history. 100 years ago, it was all about marriage and having children. Nowadays, we're coming to a more progressive state where it's about being your true self. So it is easier today, but it might have even been easier for some people and in some ways 1,000 years ago.
Thank you. That was really interesting. So now we're going to move to our question from Iona.
Hiya. I really liked those stories. Thank you. So my question is, were the ancient Greeks and Romans more or less accepting of gay and trans people than people today?
Yeah, another really good question. I think it's really easy to like imagine if we went back in time into a time machine, everything would be better and it would be like a perfect world for us LGBTQ people that are a bit different. In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. So if you were born and you were assigned female at birth, if you were believed to be a woman, your life could be very, very hard in ancient Greece and Rome, because the idea of women, you were meant to stay in the home, you had certain expectations and privileges. So if you see like the stories, often women are asking to be transformed into men, and that happens a lot in mythology, partly because that allows them to live freely. So in some ways, ancient Greece and ancient Rome was really backward. They did some things that were today we'd think were awful, sexist, really unfair to women. At the same time, their understanding of gender, whether you're male or female or something in between, was very fluid. It was more about what you did, how you lived your life, and less by what the doctor said when you were born. So it was more about whether you wanted to be a warrior or whether you wanted to stay at home, and less necessarily about how you were born. So I wouldn't say it would be better. I would say it would be different.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. That's really interesting how different parts of history interpret different identities. So our last question will be from our ambassador, Ben. So Ben has a question for you.
Hi, how would you recommend bringing in LGBTQ plus history into the classroom when it's not yet on the school curriculum?
So my belief, and I used to be a teacher for some time, and I loved teaching. I taught in a high school, is that LGBT, so that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender lives, are a part of the tapestry of being alive. So we're part of history, we're in art, we're throughout history and time. So we should just be taught like everything else. So you learn about photosynthesis, which is how flowers make their kind of food from the sun. You learn about the Tudors, you learn about Henry VIII's wives. Why don't we learn about LGBTQ people too? We've always been there. So rather than making it like an extra lesson or having to go, right, stop history lessons, we're now going to do the bit about LGBT people. Why not just say that we do it in everything? We'll do a bit of it in maths, we'll do it a bit in history, a bit in psychology, just the way that we cover everything else. I don't think it's too hard. When I was a teacher, I was able to bring in stuff into my lessons and it just felt natural. You just bring it up as part of the conversation. When people are going to school, they want to learn about the whole world, about all kinds of people. And if we're not talking about all kinds of people to young people, then, well, we're doing them a disservice and we're telling them a lie. So my way of doing it would be not to make a special lesson, just talk about it in a natural way whenever it comes up and in any lesson.
Thank you. Hopefully one day that will be more included in the curriculum. Now, I believe you have an activity you'd like everyone to participate in after the workshop.
Yeah, so the idea is I've told you just 4 myths and legends, and I would like you to make up your own myth and legend. It can use the Greek gods or the Roman gods, or you can make up your own characters. I don't care. And I want you to make a comic strip. Now, the only thing I ask is your characters have some representation where they're either showing a male character who falls in love with another man, or a woman that falls in love with a woman, or maybe someone who's born one gender, male or female, and transitions, or is somewhere in between. So get inspired by some of those stories and create a comic strip for your own myth or legend.
So I'd like to say a massive thank you to Sacha for speaking with us today, and all the ambassadors with their great questions. I'd like to remind everyone that there are loads of awesome masterclasses running all week, and you can find them at www.justlikeus.org/masterclasses. If you're on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, you can find us at Just Like Us UK. And if you've enjoyed Sacha's talk today, then you can find more from him on his social media at Sacha Coward. You can always direct message us here to let us know that you're taking part in School Diversity Week, and remember how to stay safe online. We've created a special page on the Just Like Us website with tips on how to use to stay safe online, which is www.justlikeus.org. justlikeus.org/betteronline. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you all are enjoying and involving yourself in School Diversity Week. So I'd like to say a final thank you to Sacha, and goodbye for now.